his graveyard here, you might say, well, where is it? That's not terribly helpful. That's in Greenwood Cemetery. That doesn't make any sense at all, except that some of the markers in Hill Cemetery were moved to Greenwood Cemetery. So the fact that this is in Greenwood Cemetery suggests that the records were confused and he was actually buried in Hill Cemetery, or what is now Indian Park. Here's the 1918 map. Here's the hillside area. And you see Covell there, because this is Covell's addition, right? And that is Cemetery Park, soon to be named Roundtree Park, North Park, Indian Park, Children's Park, Horse Street Park, Indian Park. Okay, Lewis's estate is probated, and then there's a tax deed in 1861 that the ownership of the cemetery goes to Grant County. This is a bit odd also because it was part of the Congregationalist Church. It was excluded from the deed transfer between Roundtree and Lewis, and there's no record of any sale of the Congregationalist Church of this land. I suppose the Congregationalist Church now could claim, hey, wait, that's our land, because there is no record of why ownership of the cemetery goes to Grant County. W.R. Beach represents Grant County. Laurie Graney has also tied him to some separate events involved in the 1850 B-Town cholera entry, and we've always wondered if it's coincidental that he is involved that he would purchase a cemetery for the county with known cholera victims. But anyway, so that's another mini mystery. Here's the general problem, that Roundtree as slave owner founds Platteville Academy. Platteville Academy is associated with the Presbyterian Church, which is anti-slavery. The Underground Railroad in Platteville is also associated with Platteville Academy. The first president of the Academy, Alvin M. Dixon, runs this railroad. And again, we could do a whole separate presentation on that, but Dixon, Picard, and Lewis are close friends by multiple records. And at the same time, as I mentioned, some free blacks in Platteville are sold back into slavery. Lewis and Roundtree are clearly on opposite sides of the issue. So how does that affect the Presbyterian Congregationalist burying grounds? And of course, this is in microcosm what macrocosmically plays out as the U.S. Civil War. And that's Indian Park today. So we're going to look at the timeline of the park during and after the Civil War. Grant County now owns the park. According to the Register of Deeds, Marilyn Pierce, there shouldn't be a tax deed in 1861 because it's a cemetery. Then by 1868, there's a Grant County quitclaim, and the deeds the Presbyterian burying ground back to John Roundtree for $3. Because Lewis has died, but Roundtree is still alive here. Ephelette and Rebecca Covell and Electa Lewis has signed a quitclaim deed to John Roundtree, and this really makes no sense because the Covells and Electa Lewis didn't own the land. They'd never owned the land. Roundtree already had a quitclaim deed recorded with Grant County. It makes no sense at all. Electa Lewis lived in Chicago by then, by the way. 1875, the tax roll records show that John Roundtree has ownership of 9, 10, 19, and 20 of Covell's addition. That's Indian Park. John Roundtree dies in 1890. So in 1895, some of his descendants sell the area that is Indian Park, lots 9, 10, 19, and 20 of Covell's addition, and several other parcels to Robert Spear. Robert Spear is a member at that time of the Grant County Board of Supervisors. He lived in Platteville. He is listed as a, quote, capitalist on the 1900 census. Don't you love that? I mean, what is meant by his being a capitalist? Well, use your imagination, I suppose. His father, John Spear, was a Platteville a member of the Platteville City Council in 1892. The 1920 census will list his father as a bank president. 1898, the Roundtree heirs attempt to sue the Presbyterian Synod to eject them from the ground and to terminate its use as a cemetery. So that would seem to indicate that some others had been buried there, but we don't know for sure. There's also that same year court document showing that Roundtree's heirs are entitled to possession of land on the south side of lots 10 and 19, but that the balance of lots 10, 19, 9, and 20 are for cemetery purposes. E.B. Rice shows up in our story again here in 1901 with this lien. And this is compensation for materials, labor, and attorney's fees carrying upkeep and maintenance of the, quote, Presbyterian burying ground. Now, why isn't it Congregationalist burying ground or Presbyterian/Congregationalist? Also in 1921, there is a deed that transfers the ownership of Indian Park Cemetery or Presbyterian burying ground, except for this tiny strip of land. This land, there's a little strip taken off, and we tried to figure out why that is. Don't know. What we do know is all of these deed transfers are odd. Okay, 1901 and 19, the tax roll records show that O.W. Barrett is the owner, but no taxes were paid as the said property is a cemetery and graveyard. And so a survey was done. Now you might be thinking, why are these things done if they are so odd? And I'll speculate about that in a moment, and it really will be no speculation. 1903, the tax roll record line is left blank. And in 1904, the tax roll record indicates that the property is now public property. It would seem that someone is trying very hard as the city expands to get this not considered a cemetery anymore, so something can be built there. That seems rather obvious. That continued up until as late as 1950, by the way, although we're not going to go that far forward. So, 1917 and 1918 are going to be two real important years with the history of this property. In 1917, the state legislature passed an act to vacate the cemetery right there. So the city is given 6 months from the passage of that act to remove all the remains to suitable lots in Greenwood Cemetery. And the use of said lands for interment are prohibited after that. Now, the city council minutes show that the council didn't vote to remove the remains until the next year, April 3rd, 1918. That is, and that's over the 10 months that they had to remove them. And you might figure that this has something to do with memory of those folks being cholera burials. At that point in time, as I mentioned, it was believed that if you dug up cholera victims, the dreaded disease could reappear. Now, 1917 was the same year that the Aiken family ordered grave markers for Thomas Aiken and Eleanor Donaldson to be placed at the new cemetery, Greenwood Cemetery, because their remains were supposed to be moved there. But according to both newspaper accounts and Laura Graney's accounts to her daughter-in-law Laurie, the Aiken family was prevented from moving these remains because they were cholera victims. Very likely other cholera victims were prevented as well. I mean, almost certainly. If one family is going to be prevented because they died of cholera, wouldn't everyone who died of cholera have to stay there? Laura Graney said that she and Laurie's father-in-law, Wilbur Graney, had buried the grave markers, and they're probably still locatable. Dick Graney, I think, said it might take a backhoe, but he's pretty sure that he knows right where they are. Copies of the grave marker photos have been sent to the Wisconsin State Historical Society, and you also, earlier in this presentation, saw a Xerox of them connected to Laura Graney's letter to the Platteville Journal. Okay, let's go on to 1918. That's when the city voted to rename the cemetery Roundtree Park. Also, they voted to remove all of the bodies and rebury them in Greenwood Cemetery. They were supposed to erect a fence, which apparently was done, and before that, notice this, empowered to level the surface of the ground. Now think of that mound in the middle. Was that leveled or not? In other words, one of the things about mound construction is that soil is going to be very dense. And even if you leveled off the top of it, the surrounding area could be worn down and the base of it could start to reappear. That's how some mounds have been located with LIDAR. Even though it's been worn down, it's still, the soil is different. So while there is no specific record of whether they leveled the surface or not, they empowered the Roundtree Park Committee to do so. And we know that the area in what is now Indian Park looked really different. It was a hilly area and it was full of springs. Now, one thing we haven't got to yet is mystery gatherings of Native people. The most likely date of the final time this happened is 1918. I'm going to talk about this in a moment, but this is a fascinating mystery connected with this park. So we're going to spend the rest of this presentation on that mystery and several others, but the modern origin of the park as a cemetery is no mystery at all. It's an easily documentable fact, and the facts match the recorded memories of Platteville residents. I think it's important to note that, because if we were to consider the memory of our grandparents, great-grandparents, as a verifiable historical fact, these other things might not be considered mysteries either. So, on to the other mysteries. First of all, there's the mystery stone. There's a native gathering, as I mentioned, in the early 1900s, and before, it seems. There's a question of whether references to burial diggings mean that there was at one point mining in the park, and is there a linear mound along with the conical mound in the park? So here is the mystery stone. Now, if you look at that stone, okay, it's a big, heavy stone, and it, at one point, apparently sat higher up. As I mentioned, there's been fill added, and as we'll see from an article, there was apparently even a base on it. But why? This doesn't look like a modern gravestone. It's a big slab stone. So consider the fate here of a fellow named John Holman. He was a Platteville resident who followed the gold rush to California along with Alexander Hamilton Willard and his family, the guy I mentioned earlier who was in the Lewis and Clark expedition. When he died on the way out there, he was buried under a large stone. They did that, and this was fairly typical, to keep, because the people who were in his family and the people that cared about him had to keep moving on, and they didn't want varmints to dig up his remains and eat them, so they put him under a big slab so that his remains would not be bothered. So we wondered, is that what happened with the mystery stone? What do those words say? How old is it? At first, it looks like maybe you can get Montgomery out of it, or a misspelling, because it's, what does this look like? M-E-E-V or C-U-M-E-E-V, or, and pretty soon you think, no, it's not Montgomery. Could there be a Latin date here somewhere? I mean, it is possible this is much older than 1850. There were people, traders, passing through this area before then. So were they just passing through, and is that what this is? The last four letters, as I mentioned, look like M-E-E-V. And as Eric Flesch has pointed out, that's a typical Eastern European name ending. And the Eastern European miners who came here weren't treated very nicely. They could be Eastern European miners who were buried separately. The difficulty with any of these is that if you look at the burial records, There's no name with this ending on any burial records we have yet found. But of course we know that there are many people who die and there's no burial records for them. Case in point, Thomas Aiken and Eleanor Donaldson not appearing on that federal mortality index that I was showing you earlier. And this could be much older than the 1850s. You know, every white person who came through didn't, you know, sign some historical document saying, I'm going through the area that will someday become Wisconsin and Platteville. There have been articles about these mysteries before. So in terms of the mystery stone, this article from the Capital Times talks about that. And mentions a fellow named Harley Ritter. I don't know if there's anyone out here who remembers him. He's before my time. But apparently he lived there, and he said that the stone, that mystery stone originally had a brick base and the name Stevens. Hearsay has it that the poor man, Stevens, under the stone had been decapitated or nearly so by a kind of Dutch windmill. Well, I don't see any way to get Stevens out of what that stone says. But don't want to hide any evidence from you, so that's the only known place where anyone has tried to decipher it, and it seems to not match the stone at all. But now let's move to another of our mysteries, which is a native gathering. So right here in 1962, the reporter said, the name now given to the site Indian Park arises from the fact that it was an early burial ground for the Indians. By the way, in 1962, not as much was known about conical, linear, and effigy mounds as now, at least by people of non-native descent. So families for miles around congregated there once a year for a powwow. They always gathered under a big oak tree. Well, there were big oak trees there, definitely, for their ceremonials. And it is assumed they moved the grapes, I think that's supposed to be graves, during one of these times, since they stopped returning rather abruptly. So that is the mystery of why were there native gatherings there? Was it for the reasons said here? Was it for other reasons? Mounds, as you saw in the quote from Ho-Chunk Elder Cloris Lowe, they were sacred places. Certainly there are ceremonials associated with mounds then and now. So here's the mound, or what we are speculating is a mound, until we can get someone to do a ground-penetrating radar study. Here are some other accounts of a native gathering. Laura Graney, who I've talked about a fair amount in here, recorded that. So did someone else, Marjorie Lathrop Dana Livingston, as recorded by her niece, Kay Tiedemann Young. Both Laura Aiken Graney and Marjorie Lathrop Dana Livingston independently recalled a gathering held sometime around 1915 to 1920. The reason that we can narrow it down to those years is simply that the age of the person that they told it to. I mean, because those folks are still alive, and how old they remember. You know, you remember your age a lot better if something happens to you and you're 5 or 7 than when you do if you're 37 or 47. So what could this gathering have been? Was it a one-time event, or was it, like the newspaper article before said, something that happened repetitively but then ended abruptly? And also notice how it corresponds to the vote to remove the bodies and level the ground. According to these two independent accounts, the gathering lasted more than one day, several in one account, a few days and nights in the other. Kay Tiedemann Young wrote that according to her aunt, the people camped right near or at the park, and they made a lot of noise for many hours. They sang and hollered, her aunt thought, to keep the white people away. The noise was particularly loud at night. At least I think that's what she told me. So that will have to just remain a mystery, but certainly if that center rise is a mound, it would make sense that there would be ceremonials there. Here's another one. What are the burying ground diggings referred to in this old article? We've really just started investigating this one. But to the north of Platteville, that fall, this fellow, J.F. Kirkpatrick, discovered the burying ground diggings. Now, given the date of this isn't a cemetery that is being referred to here. So is it referring to a native burying ground where there are also diggings? And is that where Indian Park is? Is there more than one mound there? Since the park was perhaps leveled or partially leveled, and certainly it used to be hilly, so I think it had to be partially leveled. I've got a fair amount of evidence for that. But let me go down here. Doris Scheil, her grandmother, Mary Toomey Rouse, would walk with her granddaughter through the park on the way downtown to Main Street. She was born in this area in 1876. And Mrs. Scheil remembers her grandmother telling her that there used to be more than one mound in the park. If there's anyone else out there who remembers being told that by your grandparents or some older person, we'd love to hear from you, because it makes sense. Some conical mounds appear alone, but more commonly they will appear with another conical mound or a linear mound. So of course what we did was we went looking for where these other mounds might have been. What we were looking for was compacted soil that would leave some faint outline, especially as the fill that was put in there, or just decayed grass that was there started eroding. And we think that we found it. Of course, the only way to prove this for certain would be with ground penetrating radar. But I'll show you, first of all, this is a linear mound at Wyalusing. I took a picture of this when I was there just to show you, since this is a very clearly marked linear mound, how hard it is to get good pictures of them. This one is 4 feet tall, and it's still very hard to catch on camera, though when you're standing next to it, it's somewhat obvious. They're easiest to see when they're up on a bluff like this. This is also at Wyalusing, and this is overlooking the Mississippi. But the mound part of it is just right in there. There's plenty of them closer, since Grant County has a very high concentration of native mounds. If you know where the Peniel Church is, out on Peniel Road, the people who operate that church were respectful enough to take good care of the linear mound that happens to be right next to their church. Hard to see in a picture, but kind of obvious when you're there. What people do who are photographing these from the air is usually they mark out the boundary and put some line around. So now we're in Indian Park. This goes all the way down that property line. And on this side of where this gentleman is standing, there is a drop of about a foot in elevation of the land. But if you just see this picture now, it's kind of hard to see there, isn't it? But the soil is definitely more compacted, and it falls away when you get to the boundary with those two properties on the south side. So, what's next? Well, from our two presentations, you can see there's a lot of Platteville's very early history that's revolved around Indian Park. The Native American mounds and ceremony, transformation of local geography, John Roundtree, Reverend John Lewis, Josiah Pickard, the Academy, veterans or early pioneers, cholera, smallpox, early religion, slavery, the Underground Railroad, perhaps even early mining, and the powder mill fatalities. It's because of this reason we've asked for a local historic designation for this park. And incidentally, there is no known deed between the Congregationalist Church and any other party. The Congregational Church might be interested in exploring this history further. It's their history, and that church itself is on the National Register of Historic Places. And so their burying ground implicitly linked to that history. It seems that the city of Platteville's interest in this park is periodic. Every few decades, there's an interest in repurposing the park. In the late 50s, the city council explored the idea of selling it as buildable lots, and attorney H. Block, his law office, he's no longer alive, but his law office is still in town.